Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us at the second panel for today's Machines and Media. We have a very special lineup here to discuss the intersection of artificial intelligence and local news. My name is Shreya Vaidyanathan. I am at Bloomberg looking at how we can use technology, especially artificial intelligence, for news gathering, producing, and I am excited to be joined by three panelists who work in the same space. And I will begin by introducing Cheryl Phillips, the director of Big Local News, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. And Cheryl, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got started in this space and how Big Local News operates?
Sure. Well, I came to Stanford from the Seattle Times in 2014 and wanted to see what we could do to support local journalism using computational methods. So that has been my goal. We started with collecting police records as part of the Stanford Open Policing Project, but kind of realized that there are a lot of pain points for local journalists, some of which are in local documents and local data that could be pulled together and processed a little more automatically to make it useful for journalists. So that's where we try to operate, collecting local data and processing it and making it available with supports and tools for journalists to be able to tell stories from, including everything from local agendas to COVID case data.
So your customers are journalists themselves, is that right?
Yes, and customers is an interesting word because what we do is a support for journalists. We don't charge for that.
Understood. The next panelist is Andrew Milligan, who is a news application architect at the Associated Press. The Associated Press needs no introduction. It is a very, very big newswire service. And I think, Andrew, why don't you tell us a little bit about how the AP uses AI in news and how your work intersects with local news?
Yeah, definitely. So as Shreya mentioned, I'm a news application architect, which means I spend most of my time building tools for journalists, both inside the AP and at our member organizations, to collect, analyze, interact with data on a day-to-day basis. I've also done a lot of work on our automated coverage of our live election results and automated coverage of AP Votecast, which is a big survey of the American electorate conducted by AP and NORC at the University of Chicago in the run-up to the US elections. So I'm on the data team, which at the AP runs this program called our data distribution program, where our team collects and curates and reports out and contextualizes data sets, usually which are either manually put together or something that's not publicly available already, or just something that we can combine different data sets and add a new context to it. We then distribute those data sets to our member organizations so that they can both use those data sets in their reporting generally. We usually also release them along with like a national story that our member organizations can localize and make a little bit more custom tailored to their specific readership. We've been doing a lot of sort of experimentation and work to see how we can further augment those data distributions with some more context or tooling around them to help these local organizations get as much as possible, as easily as possible from these data sets in order to really give them as much of a platform to start on as we possibly can, whether that's automatically generated text that spits out some of the key findings based on which state a member organization is in, or even simple things like preset SQL queries where reporters can put in their state and just get a few key statistics. So we're always trying to expand what we can offer in that regard.
That's fantastic. Gary, Gary Rogers is our third and final panelist, who is the editor-in-chief of RadarAI. RadarAI is a news agency in the UK. So we have panelists from 4 different time zones, by the way, on this particular occasion. And Gary, I understand that there is some commonality between what a news wire agency and like in the US, that is the AP. Can you tell us a little bit more on how Radar AI operates and who you serve?
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon from London, and I'm the editor-in-chief of RadarAI, as you say. So we've been operating since 2018. We are a news agency working in the local news sector in the UK. We combine conventional human data journalism with AI tools to help scale our work. So we work with open data in the UK, structured open data in the UK across a range of topics. We find stories in that data. The data we work with is largely very granular, so we're able to look for stories for every area of the UK. And we're then able to write those stories by using something called natural language generation, which means that our reporters have to work within a piece of software and write their stories in a somewhat algorithmic way around a template. And we feed the data through that to produce multiple versions of the story, one relevant for each area of the UK, which we distribute to subscribers in the local news sector across the country. So that form of work makes us highly productive as journalists. So we have an editorial team of 6. In 2020, we produced 140,000 local news stories and wrote 55 million words. 2021 is looking a little bit higher than that. So we're able to work at an enormous scale thanks to AI.
Fantastic. I think the sort of reason for having this panel was to explore and understand how artificial intelligence helps in news production. And I think we've had some fantastic organizations doing work on automated news stories and other kinds of repeated data journalism coverage. The question I do want to start off with is, why is local news here important, and what is the benefit of improving the way we produce local news and using technology to strengthen this coverage? Cheryl, can you tell us a little bit on how you view the significance of local area journalism and how technology is helpful?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think an example for me is where Big Local News got its start. Our pilot project was really this thing called the Stanford Open Policing Project, where we collected local police stop data. Started with a classroom assignment of mine, and then we ended up with millions of records. And we did a lot of processing of this data, but we can do stories about national patterns that we see in police stops and searches and, disparities and evidence of discrimination. Like, we can do that. But the thing is that the policy changes for those police agencies happen at the local level. So the thing that spurs change, which is what journalists tend to want when you're talking about accountability journalism, is the local story, right? And local journalists are hamstrung right now. They're financially depleted. They're trying to do the same or more with far less in the way of resources. So if we can support kind of the local journalism, if we can make the data more available, more accessible, easier to find story in the data, then we can make a big difference through a lot of local journalism, and we can tell that bigger story. We can do both. And so I think that that's an example of how you can really spur change to accountability journalism if you kind of provide supports. We've trained over 200 journalists on how to analyze the data with police stops. We've answered questions, walked them through statistical analyses, done all kinds of things to help local journalists tell that local story. And we've seen changes at the local police agency level, at the local city council level because of that. And I think that's really critical.
So civic engagement is one of the main things that local news produces, right? I think from what I'm hearing and some of the reports in the last year, we had a huge increase in the number of stories that people are engaged with in their local communities because of the pandemic. They wanted to know what is happening in my town, what is happening in this district, and those stories are being reported out and written by local news agencies. So, how do you view the intersection of community and local news, Carrie?
I think that's really important. I think as you said, the COVID pandemic has been a data story writ large, and therefore a story which every local community has wanted to know exactly what is happening in the neighborhood around them, because it affects their health directly. It's a story which has immediate relevance. So doing a job at local level for that becomes vitally important. And from the start of the pandemic, we set about doing daily automation of COVID statistics. So we were able to produce stories on case numbers and regrettably the numbers of death in each local area on a daily basis, and automate that process and semi-automate that process to deliver those stories in minutes from the point at which the data was released, and to do that on a daily basis. So that saw a huge uptake in our service from our subscribers of using those things. But just even away from COVID, just being able to tell a community story through data and to help people understand their area is a public good and almost a democratic service to enable people to make decisions better. And as Cheryl has pointed out, local news has been under immense pressure and continues to be under immense pressure. So we need to look for solutions to ensure that it does stay able to do its job. And that intersection point of, can technology find you a route to help this happen? Can a technological approach help you to do things you couldn't do by human effort alone because your human effort is under pressure or cannot be expanded? Can it enable you to do things that personalize and make the content you produce more engaging for people? Are you able to do things at a scale you could possibly do previously? And develop whole new areas of content for people to provide a better service. And if you can provide a technological solution for that, you are doing a public good. But some of that might underpin your business model as well. Because if, from what I can see in local news, one of the pillars of the future of local news may be subscription. And for subscription, there has to be a buy-in from the subscriber that they're getting something they can't get elsewhere, that you're offering them something special. And some of that may come through that personalization, that community, that locality. And it may be that AI tools help us to achieve that in a way that the human effort we have currently will not be able to do.
Can you tell us a little more on maybe an example where AI was used by a local outlet using RadarAI's service, and how they did personalize the news, what topics that they were able to really hone in on, and what the workflow looks like?
So we produce stories that are ready to publish. We work as a conventional news agency. We combine a human data journalism function with an AI scaling of output to produce stories. So we're able to produce a story not at a national level, not at a regional level, but at a much more granular level, as granular as the data is. Generally, we produce 200 to 300 versions of a story with data and angle appropriate for each version of that story. And so that allows us to inject daily data journalism into the 400 titles across the UK that use our service. And so we're able to get at that granularity and level. And we're only able to do that because we have some tooling which enables us to do that. If we tried to do it, we could do it by human effort, but it would take enormous time and probably enormous cost beyond what we could possibly afford. So we're enabled by the tools provided here.
Got it. I know that Radar, Cheryl.
Yeah, could I just add one thing, Shreya? Great. So I'm going to give two fast examples, and one is just in the the world of data journalism and supporting, technologically kind of supporting, creating structures, we have an embeddable COVID case mapper where we're using Johns Hopkins data and New York Times data, which they, put out, it kind of collected, did all the laborious work, and then put it out there for other folks to use to create an embeddable COVID case map. So a local newsroom can take a little bit of a code, stick it on their website. They get the traffic, they get the local county view, the state view of what's going on with cases, deaths, vaccinations, right? That frees up time. They don't have to worry about building their own dashboard or map or whatever, and they can go out and do reporting. So that just makes it easier. There's that, which I don't, that's not AI, right? Like that's just plain old technology, like data journalism supports. And I think doing those kinds of things, though, can make a difference. When I think about using a little more sophisticated methods, we have a thing that we're building called Agenda Watch, where we're scraping local government agendas and creating at the very base level keyword alerts. You can subscribe. We have a local wire service in the Bay Area, Bay City News, that is already using that, our prototype, to just alert them when there are stories that they're interested in covering, so that they're not individually scouring through all of these agendas. They're getting an alert when something hits that is in their bailiwick, right? And that frees up time and makes sure that they're capturing stories. And they've already found stories they wouldn't have found otherwise, because it kind of is a flag before it even hits. Like if they go to a very local agency level, or even sub-agency level, committee level, they're getting alerts well before they would have noticed before.
I think one really important thing that you're mentioning there is that a lot of these more technological approaches can require a lot of sophistication and a lot of skill and a lot of training that oftentimes local news outlets don't have the luxury of investing in that directly. And so organizations like Radar or Big Local or the AP really, I think, have this opportunity to leverage economies of scale by centralizing some of those skills and making the fruits of that labor available more broadly to support the local, more focused outlets to better cover their specific readership.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think one of the examples that you did mention was using natural language generation. What other emerging technologies do you see that has big potential in this space? Andrew, do you see any new use case of AI that is catching your attention, makes you think there's a lot of exciting work ahead?
Yeah, I mean, natural language generation is obviously a huge one, and has all kinds of use cases in journalism and beyond. Another one that is really frequently helpful is methods of identity extraction from documents in order to identify patterns or things of interest that occur in huge dumps of documents, which is one really challenging thing to deal with as a data journalist, is when you inevitably get that massive dump of a million PDFs and everybody looks to you and says, what do we do with this? It can be really hard to make sense of all of that. And so having ways to just comb through all of that and turn it into something actionable, and at least give the human reporters, a little bit of a hint of where to look, get them started, give them a couple of leads, and then they can take it from there.
I think Andrew's right about that. I think there's an interesting sort of combination of the right balance between human and machine effort around these things. And we could look at emerging technologies to help us with news gathering tasks, as Andrew's been describing, or news production tasks, and even around the distribution, around personalization, recommendation, and how we connect audiences with content we think that are relevant to them. But I think overarching thing is to try to find the right balance between the human and the machine. There are some things that machines are really great at, and luckily most of them are things that humans don't like doing. So let's focus attention on taking the repetitive drudgery tasks away from journalists and getting them to do higher value work, and bringing in some machine help to do things that need to be done, but which are too time consuming. If you want to sift through 5 million documents, you ask a machine to do it. But if you want to dig deeply into the meaning of one document, then ask a human to do that. And that's where you'll get the right balance of outcome.
I agree 100%. I think that's exactly right. I think there's a lot of exciting things happening that you can, like we had a class, for example, at Stanford this last year, working kind of adjacent to our Agenda Watch project. One of the things that they looked at was, could we detect if the volume goes up, the human volume goes up in a council meeting, like in the audio or the video of a council meeting or an agency meeting where you have commissioners or whatever and people speaking from the public. If the volume of the voice rises, is there something happening that we should know, right? Like, is there something noteworthy going on that we could send an alert, and then a human can go in and see what are people yelling at each other? What's going on? And I think that's an example of where you can use the computer, right? The AI methods to flag something that's an outlier. We should pay attention to this. Maybe there's something happening.
Got it. I think we have some questions coming in, which is amazing. Thank you all for posting questions in the chat. Continue to post them. I am reading and directing it towards our panel. So the first one was, I think, related to what we were discussing, which is, do you see news summarization as a use case for machine learning in news? Gary, is that something that RadarAI has been looking at, or is that something you've seen in the industry?
We don't currently do news summarization, but I think the technologies around that are quite interesting, and I think they offer an opportunity to give people options in how they digest news. Some of us are very time poor, and so summarization can help as an entry point to getting someone into the headlines of a story, and then to dig deeper if they have the time to do so. So we need to think about how we break news down into more component parts to be more usable in different forms that are more appropriate to our situation. Are we out and on a mobile, or are we sitting down and more relaxed and more akin to read a long form piece of journalism? Does summarization help us to engage in some things we wouldn't get to? Does notification help pull us into things? So we need to look at how these technologies can engage at different points in people's lives and the usage patterns around news to try to build engagement in something which is more focused around the audience, rather than a more newsroom driven, this is what we do and here it is, and take it or leave it. And newsrooms have moved away from that, and we need to keep embracing that ability to engage with audience in different manners.
Understood. I think another note that you did touch upon is the types of coverage itself, right? I think Cheryl also was talking about accountability journalism as a type of journalism that local news can focus on and engage with in terms of AI helping you look through a bunch of documents. Are there other types of journalism that you specifically cater to, Cheryl, or that you think is valuable here in terms of using artificial intelligence technology?
Well, I mean, that's our focus, is the local kind of accountability journalism, and that's not necessarily a big 6-month project, right? That can be day-to-day coverage of what's happening in a community. But it's pretty wide ranging. The data that we generally collect is data that you would use for more of that accountability coverage, whether it's hospital beds or something like, we have like 30 COVID related data sets, or policing or things like that. So, but you can do, I mean, ProPublica's got a great, interface for nonprofit data, right? And you can do a lot just by kind of looking through. So like that, you could look at the arts. You can do lots of stories in lots of different beats or areas of coverage that is data driven.
I think we'll see an expansion of that as well as more data becomes available. So Radar currently works in a sort of much more structured open data, but increasingly you see elements of live data happening around communities, like just for instance, pollution sensors with live data coming off them, or traffic volumes with live data. Now, useful for feeding traffic apps or information services, but also a potential source to develop news stories from, of how we look at the patterns of pollution or how we look at patterns of traffic, and to actually drive community news stories out of that sort of data gathering. So as data becomes more available, you'll see the ability to report communities better, and some of that data will require some sort of technological tooling to access for journalists to get in there and find the stories amongst the blizzard of information.
Yeah. And I actually think of that news summary idea really as a like you might use a news summary as like to produce briefs or things like that, right? You'd still, I think, want human eyes to just kind of approve, but what I think of is it's a news tip service for reporters more than anything. Like, oh wait, this is kind of interesting. I think we need to flesh it out. We need to pick up that phone. We need to go out and talk to a person because this is something that's happening that we didn't know about.
We still need to do the journalism after the technology tells us what might be available to us.
But you see a lot of the automated writing, like with financial reports or earnings reports for public companies and things like that. That's pretty, or earthquakes, like we have, the LA Times has its earthquake bot. That's great, right? Like that just alerts you, like, here's the basics. You get it out there, but then a person goes in and notices and reports out the more interesting kind of outlier stories or overall pattern stories, things like that.
Yeah, that's exactly how we've used a lot of our automated stories is we publish them to the wire, and then AP journalists will do write-throughs of them, pick up the most interesting cases and report them out a little bit more, having that starting point of all of the raw numbers, the basic facts, what we know now, and then they can flesh it out if it's of interest.
Got it. I think we've definitely covered sort of the potential and what AI can do for us. If we were to flip it around and say, okay, given that this is where AI stands and this is the coverage we need, what is missing here? Are there missing links that you notice in this intersection where more work or attention needs to be paid? Gary, do you want to see you nodding?
Yeah, well, I think I'll pick that up by saying I think that we are often overambitious about what these mysterious AI technologies can achieve, and we need a sense of proportion about them. Throughout the history of these technologies, there's been a great idea they're going to solve all their problems, and then in a few years when they don't, they die off and everyone loses interest, and then they come back again. I think we're in a period where we have an opportunity to do something different. I think we need to do that in a measured way. I think as a profession, journalism has helped write the narrative that the robots are going to take all our jobs, so it's hardly surprising that our newsrooms believe it themselves. I don't think they are. I think the future of journalism is more in how we use tools to augment what we do rather than replace what we do. And what we should replace is the things we don't like to do and the things we find hard to do, and concentrate on the things we can do well as human beings. And human intelligence is irreplaceable in journalism, I think. So we can be helped. There will be more that can be done. But it's not like a magic button where you press and the news pops out. The best judge of a story is still a human being, and the best writer of a story is still a human being, not a machine. And I think those two things will be true for the foreseeable future.
I agree with that. I'd like to add that this kind of goes with one of the comments in the chat. What's missing is that we haven't scaled yet. Right? We haven't scaled yet. We're just beginning to see the possibility of scaling. And one of the really interesting things is as governments have used third-party solutions for their technology stacks, so they hire a company to post their public agendas, to do their Zoom public meetings now because of the pandemic. as they hire third-party companies to do that, we see that there are leaders in those fields. There's about 2 or 3 companies that handle local agendas. They use the same kind of solution again and again and again for local entities. So as long as we can tap in to the technology of those 2 or 3 companies, then we can scale information from local agencies, from local governmental bodies. Same thing with local courts, right? So we have to find that low-hanging fruit where there's been some consolidation in the private sector of providing supports for agencies or nonprofits or whatever. Tap into that technological solution, see what we can extract out of it, and turn it around for journalism. And we're at the beginning stages of that, but I think there's a lot of promise there.
As you talk about scale, I'm immediately, wondering, how does the changing privacy laws play into all of this? So do you see that as a hurdle in terms of like scraping data and making data available and increase in regulation around who gets access to what data? How do you think about that?
Well, a lot of the data that we collect is we're going after data that's considered public record, but we're also working with the California Reporting Project on police misconduct records. Those are documents, sometimes redacted well, sometimes redacted not so well. So we feel like the onus is on us to make sure that we're not putting out information that could be really sensitive or private. If it was a victim of a particular crime, for example, things like that. The Open Policing Project data has, some states gave us down to the address level of the driver. Like, we're not going to release that, right? So we have to make sure that we're using automated methods to look for things like, oh, did a social security number get embedded in this data set? Did some other private information get embedded in this data set that we wouldn't want to release as an open project or as in some kind of way accessible to the public? We might want to make it available to journalists as long as they are willing to sign off on the fact that they're not going to publish that private information. So like, it's just something we have to kind of make sure we're considering and measuring and dealing with on an ongoing basis, depending on the data that we're trying to obtain. One of the things with our platform is that you can create a private project, you can add collaborators, you can share, but who you have control of that. And then it becomes an open project only when somebody wants to actually make it an open project and available to anyone who uses that data.
Understood. Andrew, do you see privacy as a blocker or something that you're tackling at the AP?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of these really important roles that the human journalist continues to play in all of this, right? Is one thing that a colleague of mine, Justin Myers, always says is that data journalism is just journalism, full stop. And I think it's really true that all of our, all of the basic core fundamentals of journalism, all of the ethical considerations, all of the things that our profession has been developing for decades, really continue to apply. They don't just go out the window because we're dealing with a data set, right? It's critical to have that human in the loop to make those determinations, right? When we do get data that's dumped or made public record when maybe it shouldn't have been, or it's overly specific about individuals, right? I think that's our role as journalists, to make that determination of what we should be publishing and what we shouldn't be.
On, I think, the same note, another question I did have was, I think the Knight Foundation introduced a grant very specific to local news and improving local news. One of the beneficiaries, I think, was the Associated Press. The NYC Media Lab got a grant to work on this, Columbia's Brown Institute, and I think another organization to look at how we can use AI, improve this intersection. Can you tell us a little bit about how the AP's role in using this grant would be, and what work this might help do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great, great project, great opportunity, and it fits right in line with so much of the work that the AP is already doing, because it's all centered around building capacity of our member organizations, right? Building capacity of local news outlets. As I was saying earlier, right, like leveraging this economy of scale, which the AP, as this massive global news outlet can really invest in some of these technologies and some of this expertise. And so this grant is mainly focused around funding and hosting trainings for local news outlets, building that capacity in their newsrooms, and developing close collaborations so that those news outlets can continue to work with us and each other, throughout the collective of the Associated Press, in order to sort of pool those resources to everybody's benefit.
I think that's going to be a really important factor, because I think the difficulties with these technological steps that industries take is that they're usually quite unevenly applied. If you're a big organization which is well resourced, you may have a bit of big organization inertia, but you have the capacity to tackle some of these things. If you're a small local news organization, then it must seem very, very daunting that apparently AI is coming to journalism and you don't know where to start. And do you need to start even? Will I be left behind here? What do I need to engage with? And so those sort of collaborative projects, I think, are really, really important in bringing everybody into the fold. But I think also there is an element of, you don't have to do everything. There are many tools out there available off the shelf to do certain tasks with. You don't have to develop some sort of automated end-to-end process for everything you do. And just a process of evaluating what it is you'd like to achieve and whether you have the skill and capacity in your organization to be able to do it or can go and get it, and to think how it fits in with your strategy for what you want to do. That starts to peel things down into small, more manageable bites, perhaps, for people, that it is all approachable, but you just have to take a long, hard look at the cost involved and the value return on whether you're going to do it or
not. One other thing about this is that I think that we're entering an era where larger news organizations are very interested in supporting local journalism. They kind of see the landscape, right? And in the past, a news organization might do a big project that would be data-driven. They would do their project, they would publish their story, boom, they'd be done. Then that data just sits there. But if we can share the data and there's local stories that can be told from the data that the big news organization, the national news organization, is not necessarily going to tell, but they can help distribute that data. I mean, the AP does a great job of this, right? And that's what we're trying to do with our platform. ABC owned stations did a big project on our pharmacy deserts across the United States. They put that data into the platform. They made it available. They had a tutorial for how to analyze the data for your local area. Center for Investigative Reporting Reveal did the same thing with racial disparities and PPP loans. They did a webinar. They did training. There have been, I think, 10 other news organizations that have done local stories out of that data because it was made available. So I think there's lots of ways to scale now that where news organizations are willing to collaborate and share more than they used to.
Absolutely. On one hand, I think we've been hearing about how journalism and journalists are getting equipped with technology, learning how to use open source tools, doing the analysis themselves. What should the technologists, on the other hand, do, or what should they be thinking about? I think all three of you have extensive experience on both sides. So if you were to say, hey, this is what we would like from the data scientists, engineers, and software developers, what do you think they should keep in mind?
Data ingestion tools, taking documents and turning it into structured data whenever possible. One thing. There was a question, I think, at some point in the chat about disinformation and how can we address that. I was part of a project here at Stanford called the Starling Labs, where we worked with Reuters and used blockchain technology to authenticate images from the first 78 days from election to inauguration, so that the images, the photos being used, you actually have a chain of metadata that can that's sealed, that can say, okay, here's where it was taken, here's where it was edited, and you can actually see that by simply clicking on a eye for information kind of thing, or a tooltip. Creating those kinds of chains of custody that are transparent and available, I think would be really useful for news organizations to help in that regard. So that's a technologist kind of solution.
I think whatever that ask is, I think the important overriding factor is that newsrooms and technologists work together. That they don't try, because quite often a new technology project will be the baby of the technology team, or if it's AI driven because it's about structured data, maybe it'll be the data team, or maybe it'll be someone more broadly in the newsroom who's responsible for new product. It's important to bring all stakeholders in your organization together to achieve this, because these are big changes. And they can't be carried by individuals or one bit of your organization. That's true for big companies, and it's true for small local news operations. It's about the ability to work together, to see the challenges together, to work out who can do what and what the requirement is. And the ultimate stakeholder is the audience you're trying to serve. So that's where it has to start. You work back from there. It's not what can we do, it's what do they need. And trying to work back and bring the team together to deliver that, both from a news journalist, pure editorial, I would like to do, to a technologist of I've worked out a way to help you to achieve something, is how people need to work.
Yeah, I think maintaining that focus on audience is exactly right. It's the readers that we're serving, right? And that mindset, that focus should be carried through into the development of the technology that's, both helping us produce the journalism and, helping us deliver the journalism. Keeping that reader as the most important stakeholder in this whole process, I think, is exactly the right mindset.
I think the last question that I would like to ask, and then we can move to some of the Q&A in the chat, is, say 5 years from now, where do you see us in the intersection of using AI for news, and especially local news? Cheryl?
5 years from now, I would say if you're a local organization, reporters will have regular alerts that flag them to the many stories that are going on in their community, right? From a local news agency kind of perspective. The reader will have a public face. They could do the same thing. We'll empower local citizens to do the same thing, and then that gets even more information out there. I think hopefully we'll see a more robust authentication system for how we're doing images now. We're starting with images, but it could go beyond that. It could go, how do you authenticate that this document really is from this agency or this person? Things like that. So I think there's a lot of potential. Probably more mundane tasks, news briefs, will be just part of the furniture of that's provided, and that a human barely has to touch. So hopefully, I'm being very idealistic, right? But hopefully then we'll see a lot more of the really important stories that a community needs being covered, because we're leveraging the power of the human by using AI technology.
I hope Cheryl's right, and I've made some notes of that list, because I think that was a really good list of things I should go and do now. So I think that's a great list. I think we're at a moment, and I think AI is going to be part of the future of journalism. And news organizations have not got a great track record with huge technological shift. If you look back over decades, the advent of the internet, more recently the growth of social platforms, perhaps news organizations were a bit slow to adopt and adapt to these things. And I would hope that at the moment they see the value to what an AI-assisted future can deliver in the local news space, and can get control of that and enable journalists to use it to serve communities.
Yeah, I would love to see, at least the start of a movement towards an increased democratization of all of this data, and of really, I think, the reporting process too. Just like Cheryl was mentioning, making these information producing resources available to the public as well, so that there's greater transparency in the whole reporting process. They have a clear, chain of custody or insight into where the reporters are getting their source information too, right? So that they have at their fingertips the ability to back out some of the reasoning behind stories, transparency into how these stories are actually being developed, and that will hopefully, start to increase some of the trust that I think journalism has kind of been struggling with.
So moving to some of the questions in the chat, I think there was one from Dan to Gary. Did you build out your tech stack internally or through collaboration? Do you and your team use AI assistants or tools to generate your content?
We built part of our tech stack internally, but we used one of our main component parts is the NLG software we use in our workflow. And we didn't build that because it's already a technology which is reasonably well developed, and there are various options available. And so we licensed something off the shelf, and we use NLG Studio by Aria because we found the interface really, really helpful for journalists who did not come from a coding background but could use the tool. And so part build, part go out and look and see what's available in the market that you can actually license and use now.
Got it. One of the other questions from Danielle was, are the AI you used trained to understand context of stories, or is that something that must be done by a human? I think we briefly touched upon this, but if you were to talk about context in some of the use cases that you deal with, what part of it is produced by the technology, and how does the human come in and add more nuance or context to it, Andrew or Cheryl?
I think you have to, you almost have to build systems that will look for the patterns and the outliers, and then flag the reporter, right? So, for example, we have the beginnings of development in code for like just a package that allows you to like scan across a lot of documents for particular patterns by a set of companies that you might want to then as a reporter identify manually. Well, I'm looking for companies in this field, right? And you create your list of the companies, and then it can go through and sift through all the documents for those companies, and then you can look for that context or pattern, but you still need the human eye. So it's kind of a collaboration between machine and reporter.
A lot of the work in the content production space is probably just better described as automated or semi-automated. AI is such an enormous potential definition; it could include almost anything. But what we're looking at is the use of tools that do need to be set up by a human. Your artificial intelligence is only as smart as the human intelligence that set it up in the first place. And I don't see that as a flaw. I see that as a strength in the way that Andrew was talking about the importance of the human oversight in an editorial process.
I think there's another question that which is interesting, which is how are the respective organizations referring to people who do the work to support AI and automation? Terms like meta journalists, I've never heard that before, and work like supporting taxonomies, honing algorithms, etc. How are you all job titling people like this? Is there anything that we should?
We have a very small staff. I mean, we're gift funded, so I have 3 staff members, and they're data journalists. That's what we call them, data journalists. I have a senior data journalist. I have data journalists. I could see there's probably room for specialization in some of these titles, and I think we're just beginning to think about like, what does that look like, and how do you make sure that folks have credit if they participated in a story or a project that maybe they didn't write a sentence in the story, but the story couldn't have happened without them. And how do you make sure that is managed appropriately so that that's clear? And I'm a big fan of giving credit where it's due, credit boxes, something more than just the traditional byline, but especially the white papers of how we did the project, like this is how, so that people can replicate, and then know all the folks involved in an effort.
I think titles and roles are really interesting and shifting around, and will continue to shift around. And currently, we're still quite wedded to traditional definitions of what people do. We still have reporters and editors, but that might shift as the roles shift. And sorry, Andrew, I spoke across you.
Oh, no. I was going to say a similar thing. At the AP, obviously, very rooted in traditional journalism, reporters and editors all the way. My team, we all refer to ourselves as data journalists. I think, like Cheryl said, that's a pretty broad term, and I feel like in a lot of these collaborations, we're still at the point where we are trying to find the right people and trying to make the most of the partners that you have, and take whatever anybody can do and put that together to be something hopefully useful, as opposed to, I think, having the luxury of upfront sort of putting people into more specific boxes. I think we haven't really figured out what those boxes are yet, in a way.
And I guess I would add one other thing, and that is like, I've been doing this a really long time. I'm kind of old. So like when I started, it was, computer assisted reporting, precision journalism, and then it became data journalism. And it's like I'm not were people before me telephone assisted reporting? I mean, at some point, it's just like, I just want to do work that makes a difference. I want to do journalistic work that makes a difference. And I know I've also been called like data innovation editor, data enterprise editor. It's like I felt like I was on the deck of the Star Trek or something. It's like, call me what you will. That's what I want to do. So.
Got it. I think the last question that I will take is, Emily had said, are these programs focused on solutions journalism rather than added to the never-ending crisis? How do you view that? And I'm guessing the interpretation of this question is, how are your programs doing solutions journalism, or is there a need to do it? And
I actually went, the Seattle Times was part of one of the very first solutions journalism collaborative efforts with our education lab. And it's a fantastic experience. I think integrating solutions journalism into what we do is really, really important. We don't want to just look, you can look for those positive outliers and use those as case studies for how, often as investigative reporters, we're looking at like, this is what's supposed to happen, but this is what's happening. Let's write about this horrible thing. But if you can find, well, this is what's supposed to happen, and here are the places where they're doing it the way it's supposed to, then it really shifts what you're looking at. You can still write the place about the places that are falling short, but you can give them a model for, well, like, what's next? We're not just leaving it out there hanging, right? And I think that data journalism is like we have the ability, because we have all the data points, of looking for those places that, well, here's the school district or school that's outperforming based on all these other metrics. And why? What are they doing differently? How can we really drill in and find the story there? I think there's just a lot of potential there. Every newsroom should be looking at that.
I think that there's a hazard in journalism that the one day's news just looks like a random series of events, and then the next day's news is a completely different random series of events, and so on and so on. And how well does it reflect what is happening in the community? And one of the starting points for doing what I do was to think whether in the gathering of news, did data provide a vital and, in some degrees, better source for explaining what actually happens in the community and how it is? So rather than report one crime, report every crime and what happens, and look at trend patterns and what really does happen in a community regarding to crime, or to education, or to transport, and try to provide some context to the reporting that data can deliver, and try to build that into a slightly perhaps more connected, linked up story of how communities are, and then to layer on the random on top of that, so people have got a context in which to understand those random yet interesting and fascinating events.
Cheryl was mentioning towards the beginning of this discussion, I think, about the fact that so much of the actual change, so much of the actual impact happens at the local level, when you can really get a story down to the point where you make it matter to the people who are reading it and make it impact or demonstrate the impact of the story in their everyday lives. I think that's where that impact actually happens. We did a huge project a couple of years ago where we collected hazard reports and inspection reports from dams all over the country. And that our main contribution there was collecting, surveying the extent of this national problem. And then so many local news outlets took that information and told the story of the dam that was close to them that was actually going to impact their readership if it failed or had some insufficiency. And that really drives when you couple the scale nationally with the local impact, I think that really drives the point home and can actually foment some of that grassroots change that then can bubble up and actually do something.
And if you think about that in the solutions journalism frame, with the open policing data, one of the things that we found is, patterns of disparity, evidence of discrimination through a variety of statistical tests. But our computational policy lab, which is our partner in that project, worked with the Nashville Police Department, which had really, really high disparities, spent about a year really drilling into what they were doing, did a paper off of it. And the police department changed its patrol policy. What they had been doing was making equipment stops, equipment violation, broken taillight type stops. They thought that doing that would deter crime. Like that was their motivation for doing that. Through looking at the data, they realized that had no impact on crime rates, local crime rates. They stopped making the equipment violation stops, traffic stops. The disparities shrank. And that's a solutions journalism story, right? Like, what can you do out of this data? You see your local community is doing all of these things. Well, here's a model where you can shrink that disparity. And this is where it happened at one police agency. And so the data can kind of drive that conversation.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I think we're at time. Again, really glad to be having this conversation with Andrew, Cheryl, and Gary. And thank you all for attending. I hope you enjoy the rest of the event today.
Thanks for moderating. This was really fantastic, Shreya.